The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a man in an expensive suit who wouldn't meet my eyes. That should have been my first warning. When someone can't look at you directly, they're either lying or delivering news that will change your life forever. I stood in the doorway of my father's study, watching as he read the single sheet of cream-colored paper with hands that trembled despite his efforts to appear composed. Michael Brennan had built his construction empire through careful negotiation and calculated risks, but the pallor spreading across his face suggested he'd just encountered a debt that couldn't be paid with money. "Dad?" My voice sounded small in the oak-paneled room, childlike despite being 26 years old with a master's degree in art history and 3 years of experience managing the city's premier auction house. He looked up, and I saw something I'd never witnessed before in my father's eyes. Defeat. Pure, absolute surrender to circumstances beyond his control. "Isabel," he said, folding the letter with precise movements that suggested he was buying time to find the right words. "We need to talk about your future." My future. As if it were a negotiable commodity, rather than the carefully planned trajectory I'd spent years constructing. In 6 months, I was scheduled to open my own gallery in the warehouse district downtown. The lease was signed, the investors secured, the artists already chosen for the inaugural exhibition. My future was mapped with the precision of a military campaign. "What's happened?" I asked, stepping into the study, despite every instinct screaming that I should turn around and pretend I'd never seen that letter, or the messenger who delivered it. "There are debts," my father began, then stopped, seeming to gather strength from somewhere deep within. "Not financial debts. Those I could manage. These are obligations of honor. Promises made when I was younger and more desperate than I've allowed you to understand." The word honor hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. In my father's generation, honor meant things that had nothing to do with personal choice or individual autonomy. It meant promises that bound not just the person who made them, but their children and their children's children. "What kind of promises?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. You don't send men in expensive suits to deliver good news about promises that were made in honor. "The Valentino family helped me when the business was failing, when your mother was sick and medical bills were consuming everything we had. They asked for nothing in return except my word that someday, if they needed assistance, I would provide it without question or hesitation." The Valentino family. Even someone as deliberately sheltered as I had been couldn't avoid knowing that name. They appeared in newspaper articles written in careful euphemisms, discussed at charity galas in whispers that stopped when the wrong people approached. The kind of family that owned legitimate businesses while maintaining interests that didn't bear close scrutiny. "They're calling in the debt," I said, not really asking. The certainty settled over me like ice water, cold and absolute. My father's silence confirmed what I'd already understood. When families like the Valentinos called in debts of honor, they didn't accept monetary compensation or business favors. They wanted something more valuable, more permanent, more binding than contracts or cash transfers. "Matteo Valentino requires a wife," my father said, the words emerging as barely more than a whisper. "His business interests demand the appearance of stability, family connections that signal he's moving toward legitimate enterprises. Your education, your work in the art world, your reputation, these things have value to someone trying to reshape his public image." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet, though I remained standing through sheer force of will. An arranged marriage. In the 21st century, in a major American city, with a man whose family tree was rooted in soil watered with blood and violence? And if I refuse? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Deaths of honor didn't come with opt-out clauses. Then everything we've built collapses. The business, this house, your mother's medical trust fund, the scholarships we've established in her name, all of it becomes forfeit. The Valentino family doesn't accept partial payment on debts they've chosen to collect. The calculation was ruthlessly simple. My freedom in exchange for my father's legacy and my mother's memory. One life sacrificed to preserve the carefully constructed monuments to another life that had ended too soon. When? The question emerged steadily, surprising me with its calm acceptance of inevitable fate. The wedding is scheduled for 3 months from today. Matteo has insisted on a traditional ceremony, family attendance, all the appearances of a genuine union. He wants the world to believe this is a love match rather than a business transaction. 3 months to dismantle the life I'd built. 12 weeks to say goodbye to dreams that had sustained me through grief and uncertainty. 90 days before I became the wife of a man I'd never met, bound by promises my father had made before I was born. I turned toward the window, watching autumn rain streak the glass like tears the room itself was crying, for futures that would never materialize. Somewhere in this city, Matteo Valentino was receiving news that his bride had been secured, his family's honor satisfied, his path toward legitimacy paved with my forced cooperation. "Tell them I agree," I said, not looking at my father because I couldn't bear to see relief in his eyes at my surrender. "But understand this. I'll fulfill the letter of whatever agreement you've made, but I won't pretend to be grateful for the honor of becoming a prisoner in an expensive cage." As I left the study, I heard my father whisper something that might have been an apology or a prayer. But apologies couldn't change circumstances, and prayers had never protected me from the consequences of other people's desperation. 3 months until I became Mrs. Matteo Valentino. 12 weeks to prepare for a life I'd never chosen. 90 days before I discovered whether arranged marriages could survive when one partner viewed the union as imprisonment and the other as a business merger that happened to involve human beings instead of corporate assets. The rain continued falling as I climbed the stairs to my room, each drop marking time until my carefully planned future transformed into something I couldn't control or escape. Some prisons came with wedding rings instead of bars, but they were prisons nonetheless. Chapter 1. The Valentino estate sat behind iron gates that spoke of old money trying desperately to appear respectable. I studied the mansion through the town car's tinted windows, cataloging architectural details the way I'd been trained to analyze paintings, looking for truth beneath carefully constructed surfaces. Victorian Revival, I noted mentally. Probably built in the 1920s during Prohibition, when families like the Valentinos had accumulated enough wealth to demand physical monuments to their power. The limestone facade gleamed white in the October sunlight, turrets and balconies creating dramatic shadows that suggested romance while hinting at darker purposes. "We've arrived, Miss Brennan," the driver said unnecessarily, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to comment on his passenger's circumstances. I smoothed my dress navy silk that cost more than I'd normally spend on a month's wardrobe, chosen specifically to project confidence I didn't feel. First impressions mattered, especially when meeting the man you'd been sold to in payment of your father's debts. The front door opened before I could knock, revealing a woman in her 50s whose severe expression suggested she'd perfected the art of intimidation through decades of practice. "Miss Brennan," she said, not quite a question, "Mr. Valentino is expecting you in his study. Follow me." The interior matched the exterior's ostentatious display of wealth. Original artwork lined the walls, recognizable pieces from collections that shouldn't have been privately held. A Monet that had disappeared from a Paris gallery in the 1970s. A Rembrandt drawing that museums had spent years trying to locate. Either the Valentino family had remarkable luck at estate sales, or their acquisition methods involved fewer legal complications than traditional collectors employed. "You're familiar with the collection," the woman observed, catching me studying a landscape that looked suspiciously like a missing constable. "I work in art authentication," I replied, letting the implication hang in the air between us. Or rather, I did before circumstances changed my career trajectory. Her expression shifted slightly, something that might have been respect flickering across stern features. "Mr. Valentino appreciates expertise. You'll find he's not what you've been led to expect." Before I could ask what that meant, she stopped before a set of double doors carved with intricate patterns that suggested Italian craftsmanship. She knocked once, then opened the doors without waiting for permission. "Miss Brennan, sir." The study was exactly what I'd imagined, and nothing like I'd feared. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with volumes that showed signs of actual reading rather than decorator arrangement. A massive desk dominated the room's center, but the man behind it stood immediately, moving with fluid grace that suggested either athletic training or something more dangerous. Matteo Valentino was not what I'd expected. The photographs I'd found online, carefully controlled publicity shots from charity galas and business conferences, hadn't prepared me for the reality of his presence. Tall, perhaps 6'3", with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of winter storms. His suit was expertly tailored, probably Italian, definitely expensive, but he wore it with casual indifference that suggested comfort with power rather than need to display it. "Miss Brennan," he said, his voice carrying traces of an accent that had been carefully refined but not completely eliminated. "Thank you for coming." "As if I had a choice," I replied, deciding immediately that pretending this was anything other than a business transaction would be insulting to both our intelligences. Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or approval. "Honesty. I was told you were direct. The reports didn't adequately convey how refreshing that quality would be." "Reports?" The word emerged sharper than intended. "You've been having me investigated?" "Extensively." He gestured toward a leather chair positioned across from his desk. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss, and I prefer conversations that don't require neck strain from standing across rooms from each other." I sat, primarily because remaining standing felt like childish defiance. As I settled into the chair, Matteo resumed his seat, then opened a folder that lay on his desk. The thickness of the file suggested his investigation had been thorough to the point of invasion. "Isabelle Marie Brennan," he began, reading from documents I couldn't see. 26 years old, master's degree in art history from Columbia, currently assistant director at Morrison Auction House, specializing in authentication of European paintings from the 15th through 19th centuries. Fluent in French and Italian, conversational in German. No criminal record, no outstanding debts, no romantic entanglements currently or in the past 2 years. The clinical recitation of my life felt like watching myself dissected for scientific study. You forgot to mention my coffee preferences and whether I prefer cats to dogs. Light roast, 2 sugars, no cream, he replied without missing a beat. And you're allergic to cats, so the dog preference is medical necessity rather than aesthetic choice. The thoroughness of his investigation should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a strange kind of relief. At least we were operating with complete information, both sides understanding exactly what they were getting into. What else do your reports tell you? I asked, genuinely curious about what else he might have uncovered about my carefully ordered life. Matteo closed the folder, leaning back in his chair with movements that suggested he was evaluating how much honesty to employ. They tell me you're intelligent, driven, independent to the point of isolation. That you've spent the past 3 years building a career designed to prove you didn't need your father's connections or money. That you visit your mother's grave every Sunday morning regardless of weather or previous evening's activities. That you're terrified of becoming trapped in circumstances you can't control, which makes this arrangement particularly cruel. The accuracy of his assessment cut deeper than I'd expected. He'd identified not just facts, but motivations, fears, the psychological landscape that explained behavior patterns visible only to careful observation. And knowing all this, I said slowly, you still want to proceed with a marriage that forces me into exactly the situation I've spent years trying to avoid? Want is perhaps too strong a word. Matteo's honesty was brutal, but somehow less offensive than false sympathy would have been. I require a wife to satisfy business interests and family expectations. You require protection for your father's legacy. Our mutual need creates opportunity for arrangement that serves both parties, even if neither of us would have chosen this path voluntarily. That's remarkably cold analysis of what's supposed to be a lifetime commitment. Would you prefer I pretend this is romantic? His question carried genuine curiosity rather than mockery. That I claim love at first sight or divine destiny? We're both too intelligent for comfortable lies, Miss Brennan. The truth may be uncomfortable, but at least it's honest. I studied his face, looking for the monster my imagination had constructed during sleepless nights since learning about the arranged marriage. What I found instead was someone who seemed as trapped by circumstances as I was, bound by family expectations and business necessities that allowed little room for personal preference. Tell me about the expectations, I said, deciding that if we were being honest, I might as well understand the full scope of what I was agreeing to. What exactly does being your wife entail? Matteo stood, moving to a sideboard where crystal decanters held amber liquid that probably cost more per bottle than I made in a month. He poured 2 glasses without asking if I wanted one, then returned to place one in front of me before resuming his seat. Publicly, you'll be my wife in every visible way, he began, the whiskey catching light as he raised his glass. Attendance at family gatherings, business functions, charity galas. Your presence signals stability, legitimacy, the kind of family-oriented image that reassures business partners and regulatory authorities. And privately? I asked, though I wasn't certain I wanted to hear the answer. Privately, we maintain separate lives within shared space. This estate has 23 rooms. I'm certain we can avoid each other when necessary while maintaining appearances when required. Your career continues without interference. Your independence remains as intact as circumstances allow. I'm not interested in a prisoner, Miss Brennan. I'm interested in a partner who understands the terms of our arrangement and can fulfill her role without requiring constant supervision or coercion. The offer was more generous than I'd anticipated, though still fundamentally a cage, regardless of how spacious or gilded. But perhaps the size of the cage mattered when you couldn't avoid imprisonment entirely. What about other relationships? The question emerged before I could consider whether I actually wanted to know the answer. Mateo's expression darkened slightly, the first real emotion I'd seen since entering the study. Are you asking if I expect fidelity in a marriage neither of us chose? I'm asking about the rules of engagement for a business arrangement that happens to involve wedding vows. He was quiet for a long moment, studying his whiskey as if it might contain answers to questions neither of us wanted to articulate. I require discretion, he said finally. What you do privately is your concern, provided it doesn't create public embarrassment or security complications. The same applies to me. The clinical discussion of infidelity before we'd even been married should have felt wrong, but instead it felt honest. We were negotiating terms of a contract that happened to be enforced by tradition rather than courts, establishing boundaries that might make the arrangement bearable for both parties. When? I asked, accepting that this marriage was inevitable, and that further resistance would accomplish nothing except prolonging uncomfortable conversations. 3 weeks, Mateo replied. The ceremony will be held here, family and close associates only. Traditional Catholic service, despite neither of us being particularly religious. Appearances matter more than authenticity in these situations. 3 weeks until my life became irrevocably entwined with a man I'd just met, bound by promises that meant more to our families than to us. The timeline was aggressive, but perhaps that was better than months of dreading inevitable fate. I have conditions, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I expected you would. Mateo leaned forward, giving me his complete attention. Name them. My gallery project continues. I've invested 3 years of planning and my entire professional reputation in opening that space. The arranged marriage doesn't cancel contracts I've already signed or commitments I've already made. Agreed. In fact, Valentino Family Resources can expedite permits and contractor schedules that have been creating delays. Consider it a wedding gift. The casual offer of assistance that would normally require months of bureaucratic navigation demonstrated exactly how much power he wielded. Permits that took ordinary citizens months could be acquired in days when the right people made the right requests. Second condition. My father's debts are considered fully paid once we're married. No lingering obligations, no future favors owed, no additional prices to be extracted when convenient for your family. The debt will be satisfied, Mateo confirmed. You have my word. Third condition. I want complete honesty about your business operations. I won't be blindsided by federal investigations or surprised by newspaper exposés because I was deliberately kept ignorant of illegal activities happening around me. This condition seemed to surprise him, his expression shifting from careful neutrality to something that might have been respect. Most people prefer plausible deniability. Most people aren't being forced into marriages with men whose business interests exist in legal gray areas. If I'm going to be your wife, even in arrangement only, I want to understand exactly what that means and what risks I'm accepting. Mateo was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh the wisdom of complete honesty against the safety of selective disclosure. When he finally spoke, his voice carried gravity that transformed our conversation from negotiation into something more significant. The Valentino family built our fortune through methods that wouldn't survive close legal scrutiny, he began. Prohibition, gambling, labor disputes resolved through intimidation rather than arbitration. traditional activities that every organization like ours engaged in during different eras. But I'm not my grandfather or my father. I'm working to transition legitimate business interests while managing obligations and expectations from family members who view change as betrayal of tradition. Meaning you're still involved in criminal activities, but trying to appear respectable? Meaning I'm navigating complex transitions that require time and careful strategy. Yes, there are still operations that exist outside legal boundaries. But, increasingly, Valentino family wealth comes from legitimate sources: construction, real estate development, import/export businesses that don't require customs officials looking the other way. The marriage to you accelerates that transition by providing social legitimacy that money alone can't purchase. The honesty was more than I'd expected, and somehow made the situation feel less like prostitution and more like a genuine business arrangement where both parties understood the terms and potential consequences. "I accept," I said, the words feeling both momentous and anticlimactic. "I'll marry you, fulfill my public obligations as your wife, and maintain appearances that satisfy your family's expectations. In exchange, you'll honor the conditions I've outlined and provide the honesty necessary for me to navigate this world without stumbling blindly into situations I don't understand." Matteo stood, extending his hand across the desk in a gesture that felt more like sealing a corporate merger than planning a wedding. "Then we have an agreement, Miss Brennan. Welcome to the family." As I shook his hand, feeling the controlled strength in his grip, I wondered if arranged marriages based on mutual benefit and honest negotiation might actually survive better than romantic unions built on passion that inevitably faded. Time would tell whether our clinical approach to matrimony was wisdom or simply mutual delusion about our ability to control circumstances that were fundamentally uncontrollable. The drive back to my apartment felt longer than the journey to the Valentino estate, though the actual distance hadn't changed. I stared out the window, watching the city pass by while processing the reality that in 3 weeks I would become Mrs. Matteo Valentino, bound to a man I barely knew in service of debts I'd never incurred. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. "How did it go?" I typed a response that felt both honest and incomplete. "Better than expected. Worse than hoped. The wedding is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks to dismantle the life I'd built. 21 days to prepare for existence I couldn't yet imagine. 504 hours until I discovered whether arranged marriages could become something other than elaborate performances of commitment neither party genuinely felt." As the car pulled up to my building, I realized that Matteo Valentino hadn't once tried to charm me or pretend our arrangement was anything other than a business transaction. That honesty felt more respectful than false promises of affection would have been. Perhaps we could build something functional, if not romantic, on a foundation of mutual understanding and carefully negotiated boundaries. Or, perhaps, I was simply trying to find comfort in a situation that offered none, hoping that acceptance of inevitable circumstances might feel less like surrender and more like strategic adaptation to realities beyond my control. Chapter 2. The wedding dress arrived 6 days before the ceremony, delivered in a garment bag that probably cost more than the gown inside. I hung it in my closet without opening the bag, unable to face the physical manifestation of promises I would make under coercion rather than choice. My apartment felt smaller each day, as if the walls were closing in to remind me that this space, my space, earned through work and maintained through careful budgeting, would soon become merely a memory of independence I'd briefly possessed before circumstances demanded surrender. I was cataloging personal items that would make the move to the Valentino estate when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was local. "Miss Brennan?" A woman's voice, professional but warm. "This is Maria Santos. I'm calling on behalf of the Valentino family to discuss arrangements for your transition to the estate." Transition. As if moving into my future husband's home was a corporate relocation rather than the end of autonomy I'd fought years to establish. "What kind of arrangements?" I asked, setting down the box I'd been packing. "Mr. Valentino has requested that I assist with logistics, moving your belongings, establishing your personal spaces within the estate, coordinating any special requirements you might have. He's anxious that the transition be as smooth as possible and that you feel comfortable." The careful pause before the word comfortable suggested Maria understood exactly how unlikely comfort was in these circumstances, but her tone carried genuine concern rather than the cold efficiency I'd expected from Valentino family employees. "When would you like to begin?" I asked, because resisting inevitable changes accomplished nothing except prolonging discomfort. "I'm actually outside your building now, if you're available to discuss the details in person." The presumption should have annoyed me, but instead I felt oddly grateful that someone was taking charge of logistics I had no experience navigating. "I'll be right down." Maria Santos looked nothing like I'd imagined a Mafia family employee would appear. Mid-40s, dressed in elegant business casual attire, with warm brown eyes that suggested genuine kindness beneath professional competence. She stood near a sleek black SUV, smiling as I emerged from the building. "Miss Brennan," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice." We settled at a coffee shop 2 blocks from my apartment, Maria ordering espresso while I stuck with my usual light roast, wondering if she was taking notes for Matteo's growing file on my personal habits and preferences. "I've worked for the Valentino family for 12 years, Maria began without prompting, as if anticipating my questions about her role and loyalties. "I manage household staff, coordinate family events, and occasionally handle special projects that require discretion and organizational skills. Your transition falls into that latter category." "Why would moving my belongings require discretion?" "Because Mr. Valentino wants you to feel that the estate is truly your home, not simply a beautiful prison you're required to inhabit. He's instructed me to accommodate any requests you might have, within reason, to make your living spaces reflect your personality and preferences rather than simply conforming to existing decor." The thoughtfulness surprised me, though I wasn't certain whether it reflected genuine consideration for my comfort or simply strategic thinking about maintaining appearances of marital contentment. "I wasn't planning to bring much," I admitted. "The apartment is furnished, and most of what I own wouldn't fit the estate's aesthetic anyway." Maria's smile held understanding that went beyond surface sympathy. "Perhaps you should see your personal spaces before making that decision. Mr. Valentino has allocated several rooms for your exclusive use. A private study, a studio space he thought you might use for art projects, and, of course, your bedroom suite. They're currently unfurnished, waiting for your direction about how they should be arranged." "Separate bedrooms?" I asked, seeking confirmation of what Matteo had implied during our first meeting. "Of course. The master suite is Mr. Valentino's domain. Your suite is equally spacious, with its own sitting area, walk-in closet, and en-suite bathroom. Connected to his rooms, but with separate entrance and lockable doors, should you prefer privacy." The arrangement spoke to Matteo's commitment to maintaining the boundaries we'd established. Whatever else this marriage entailed, it apparently wouldn't include unwanted intimacy or invasions of private space. "When can I see these rooms?" I asked, curiosity overcoming my reluctance to engage too deeply with realities I still hoped might somehow change. "Today, if you're available. Mr. Valentino is traveling for business, but left instructions that you should have complete access to the estate whenever you wish. Consider it your home starting now, rather than waiting for the ceremony to grant you permission to exist in spaces that will soon be legally yours." An hour later, I found myself back at the Valentino estate, this time being led through corridors I hadn't seen during my first visit. Maria moved with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the mansion's layout, pointing out features and amenities as we climbed a sweeping staircase to the third floor. "The family wing," she explained, gesturing down a hallway lined with closed doors. Mr. Valentino's parents occupy the east side when they're in residence, though they spend most of their time in Italy now. His sister's rooms are kept ready for visits, though she lives in Boston with her husband and children. "And this," she stopped before a set of double doors, "will be yours." The bedroom suite was stunning, and nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the heavy, dark furniture that dominated the rest of the estate, these rooms had been designed with light and space in mind. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the estate's gardens, flooding the space with natural light that made the cream-colored walls seem to glow. The sitting area was arranged around a fireplace, empty bookshelves waiting to be filled with volumes that would make the space feel inhabited rather than simply decorated. "Mr. Valentino wanted you to have southern exposure," Maria said, moving to the windows. "He remembered you mentioning during your meeting that you prefer natural light for reading, so he had these rooms prepared specifically with that in mind." The consideration felt disproportionate to a single offhand comment I'd made during our negotiations. Either Matteo was remarkably attentive to details, or his files contained transcripts of our conversation that he'd studied for insights into my preferences. "And through here," Maria continued, opening a door that connected to an adjacent room, "is your study." The study was perfect. There was no other word for it. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, with a massive desk positioned to take advantage of garden views. A comfortable reading chair sat in one corner, positioned near both natural light and a smaller fireplace that would provide warmth during Chicago's brutal winters. The space felt designed for someone who valued books and learning, somewhere that encouraged intellectual work rather than simply serving as attractive backdrop for family photographs. "There's one more room," Maria said, her smile suggesting she'd saved the best for last. "Mr. Valentino wasn't certain what you'd want, so he left it completely empty for you to decide its purpose." The third room was indeed empty, hardwood floors gleaming beneath windows that offered different views of the estate grounds. But the quality of light was extraordinary, soft and diffuse, perfect for examining artwork or creating detailed paintings that required careful attention to color and shadow. "He thought you might want a studio space," Maria explained, "given your background in art history and authentication. But if you'd prefer to use the room for something else, that's entirely your decision." I stood in the center of the empty room, overwhelmed by the realization that Matteo had been listening during our conversation in ways I hadn't fully appreciated. These spaces weren't generic guest accommodations. They'd been specifically designed to match interests and preferences he'd identified through investigation and direct interaction. "Why is he doing this?" I asked, not really expecting Maria to know the answer. "Because Mr. Valentino understands that arrangements made from necessity rather than choice require additional effort to make them bearable for both parties," she replied. He can't give you freedom to refuse the marriage, but he can provide spaces where you feel less trapped by circumstances neither of you would have chosen voluntarily. The honesty was refreshing and somewhat devastating. Matteo wasn't trying to make me love him or even like him particularly. He was simply trying to make a difficult situation marginally more tolerable by respecting my need for personal space and autonomy within the constraints of our arranged union. We spent the next 2 hours discussing logistics. What furniture I'd want to bring from my apartment, what needed to be purchased new, how my belongings would be moved and arranged. Maria's competence was remarkable. Her organizational skills transforming what should have been an overwhelming task into a series of manageable steps that felt almost enjoyable in their efficiency. "One last thing," Maria said as we prepared to leave. "Mr. Valentino asked me to give you this." She handed me a credit card embossed with my name. "For any purchases you need to make, furniture, clothing, personal items. There's no limit and no oversight regarding how you choose to spend. Consider it a practical necessity for someone establishing household in a new residence." I stared at the card, understanding that accepting it meant accepting another layer of dependence on the Valentino family's resources. But refusing it would be foolish pride that accomplished nothing except making the transition more difficult. "Tell Mr. Valentino thank you," I said, tucking the card into my purse, "and tell him I appreciate his efforts to make this situation less awful than it could be." Maria's smile held something that looked like approval. "I'll convey your gratitude, though I should mention, Mr. Valentino doesn't do any of this seeking thanks. He does it because treating people with basic dignity costs him nothing and potentially gains cooperation that makes everyone's lives easier." As I drove back to my apartment in the car Maria had arranged, I considered the strange dynamic developing between Matteo and myself. We were approaching marriage like a business partnership, establishing terms and boundaries with the cold efficiency of corporate executives negotiating a merger. But beneath that clinical surface, there seemed to be genuine effort to make the arrangement bearable, perhaps even functional. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Maria tells me you approved the suite arrangements. I'm pleased. If you think of anything else you need, let her know. The goal is comfort, not imprisonment. M." The message was characteristically direct, devoid of romantic sentiment, but carrying a kind of consideration that felt more valuable than empty promises of affection. Matteo understood that he was imposing on my life in fundamental ways, and he seemed determined to mitigate that imposition however possible within the constraints of circumstances neither of us could escape. I typed a response. "Thank you for the consideration. The spaces are more than I expected. See you at the wedding." His reply came immediately. "Unfortunately, yes. Though I promise to make the ceremony as brief as family expectations allow. 2 hours of our lives will never recover, but perhaps bearable if we view it as necessary performance art." Despite myself, I smiled at the message. Performance art. An accurate description of what we were about to undertake. An elaborate theatrical production designed to convince our families and the watching world that we were entering marriage voluntarily rather than under coercion. Perhaps arranged marriages based on mutual understanding and honest acknowledgement of practical necessities had better chances of success than romantic unions built on passion that inevitably faded. Or perhaps I was simply trying to find comfort in a situation that offered none, hoping that acceptance might feel less like surrender and more like strategic adaptation. Only time would tell which interpretation was closer to truth. Chapter 3. The wedding day arrived with weather that seemed deliberately symbolic. Heavy clouds, threatening rain, but not quite committing to the storm. I stood before the mirror in the bridal suite Maria had prepared, studying a reflection that looked like someone else entirely. The dress was exquisite. Ivory silk with delicate lace details that probably cost more than 6 months of my former salary. It fit perfectly, tailored to my measurements by someone who understood that wedding gowns should enhance rather than overwhelm. But the woman wearing it looked lost, eyes carrying anxiety that no amount of professional makeup could completely conceal. "You look beautiful," Maria said softly from the doorway. She'd been managing last-minute details all morning, but somehow always appeared exactly when I needed support without having to ask for it. "I look like I'm attending my own execution," I replied, deciding that honesty with at least one person today was worth the risk of appearing ungrateful. Weddings and executions do share certain theatrical elements, Maria agreed, moving to adjust my veil with practiced hands. Both involve elaborate costumes, ceremonial procedures, and audiences watching to see how the principal parties handle the pressure. The comparison made me laugh despite the knot of anxiety in my chest. Is Mr. Valentino similarly philosophical about today's events? Mr. Valentino is downstairs consuming whiskey while his brother tries to convince him that marriage won't actually kill him, just change certain aspects of his life in ways he'll need years to fully appreciate. Maria's tone carried affectionate amusement. Men handle nerves differently than women, but the underlying anxiety is remarkably similar. The idea that Matteo might be as uncomfortable with today's ceremony as I was had never occurred to me. I'd assumed he viewed the wedding as a necessary business transaction, emotionally neutral rather than actively distressing. Learning that he apparently required alcohol to face the altar made him seem more human, less the cold strategist I'd constructed in my imagination. 5 minutes, Maria said, checking her watch. Your father is waiting to escort you downstairs. The ceremony will be brief. Father O'Brien has been instructed to minimize homilies about love and commitment that would be awkward given the circumstances. I took a final look in the mirror, seeing a bride who would convince the watching guests that she'd chosen this fate willingly. The performance Maria had described was about to begin, and I'd spent enough years presenting confident facades to know how to play my role convincingly. My father waited in the hallway, looking older than I remembered him appearing just weeks earlier. Guilt had apparently accelerated aging, carving new lines around his eyes and mouth that spoke to sleepless nights spent contemplating the price his daughter was paying for his past desperation. "Isabel," he said, voice catching on my name. "You look—" "Save it, Dad," I interrupted, not unkindly but firmly. "We both know why we're here. The pretty words won't change circumstances, so let's just get through today with whatever dignity we can manage." He flinched at my bluntness, but nodded acceptance. We began the descent to the first floor, where traditional wedding music was already playing to signal the ceremony's imminent beginning. The main salon had been transformed into an elaborate chapel, with flowers and candles creating the romantic atmosphere that was supposed to accompany voluntary unions. Perhaps 50 guests filled the chairs. Valentino family members, business associates, a few faces I recognized from charity galas my father had attended. Everyone dressed formally, playing their roles in the elaborate performance we were all participating in. Matteo stood at the altar with his brother beside him, both men in perfectly tailored tuxedos that made them look like they'd stepped from magazine spreads about elegant wealth. But as my father led me down the aisle, I caught Matteo's expression and saw something that might have been genuine relief that I'd actually shown up rather than fleeing to avoid this fate. Father O'Brien was elderly, with kind eyes that suggested he'd presided over enough marriages to recognize when couples were entering unions for reasons other than love. His homily was mercifully brief, focusing on commitment and partnership rather than passion or romance that would have been inappropriate given everyone's understanding of our arrangement's true nature. Do you, Matteo Alessandro Valentino, take Isabel Marie Brennan to be your lawfully wedded wife? Father O'Brien asked, the traditional words sounding strange when applied to arrangements negotiated by lawyers rather than courtship. I do, Matteo replied, his voice steady despite the whiskey Maria had mentioned. He met my eyes as he spoke, and I saw acknowledgement there. We were both performing necessary roles, but at least we were doing it together rather than forcing one party to carry the burden alone. And do you, Isabel Marie Brennan, take Matteo Alessandro Valentino to be your lawfully wedded husband? The pause before I answered stretched just long enough that worried murmurs rippled through the assembled guests. This was my last chance to refuse, to walk away from obligations I'd never agreed to and consequences I couldn't fully predict. But walking away meant destroying my father's legacy, abandoning promises that predated my birth, choosing my freedom over responsibilities that extended beyond personal preference. I do, I said finally, the words feeling both enormous and meaningless. A promise extracted under coercion, but a promise nonetheless. Matteo slid a ring onto my finger, a band of platinum set with diamonds that caught light like captured stars. It was beautiful and felt like a shackle, even as I performed the reciprocal gesture of placing his wedding band on his hand with movements that seemed choreographed despite never having been rehearsed. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Father O'Brien said with relief that suggested he'd been uncertain about the ceremony's outcome. You may kiss the bride. This was the moment I'd been dreading most. The public demonstration of affection that would signal to watching guests that our union was voluntary rather than coerced. But Matteo's kiss was gentle, almost chaste, his lips barely brushing mine in contact that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before he stepped back with movements that suggested respect for boundaries we'd established. The guests applauded, and I wondered how many of them understood the true nature of what they were witnessing. Probably most arranged marriages weren't exactly uncommon in families like the Valentinos, where business interests often took precedence over personal preference. The reception was held in the estate's ballroom, an enormous space filled with more flowers, more candles, more elaborate decorations designed to create the impression that this was a celebration rather than a business transaction being formalized through ceremony and paperwork. I moved through the crowd in a daze, accepting congratulations from people I'd never met, dancing with Matteo's relatives who welcomed me to the family with warmth that seemed genuine despite their knowledge of our arrangement's origins. Everyone was performing their assigned roles with remarkable commitment to the illusion of normalcy. You're handling this better than I'd feared, Matteo said, as we danced our obligatory first dance while photographers captured images that would be used to convince the world we were a legitimate couple. I've had years of practice pretending to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations, I replied, maintaining the smile that was beginning to make my face ache. Gallery openings, donor dinners, networking events where every interaction is performance art designed to advance professional goals. This is just another performance, albeit with higher stakes. Does it help to think of it that way? His question carried genuine curiosity. As performance rather than reality? It helps me get through the day without having a panic attack in front of your relatives, I admitted, grateful that the music's volume meant our conversation remained private despite the crowd surrounding us. Whether it helps long-term remains to be seen. The dance ended, and we were immediately separated by well-wishers wanting to offer private congratulations and advice about married life that ranged from touching to uncomfortable. I endured it all with the same practiced smile, counting down hours until this performance would end and I could retreat to the bedroom suite that was now technically my home. As evening approached, guests began departing with air kisses and promises to host us for dinner once we'd settled into married life. The exodus felt like a prison door closing, the last connection to my previous existence disappearing as the Valentino family claimed complete possession of my present and future. Traditionally, Matteo's mother said, approaching me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the bride and groom would retire to begin their honeymoon. But Matteo has explained that you've requested separate accommodations, which is unconventional, but acceptable if it makes you comfortable. The forced acceptance in her tone made it clear she found our arrangements peculiar, possibly insulting to family tradition she valued. But she was apparently willing to overlook unconventional choices if they served larger strategic purposes. I appreciate your understanding, I replied, maintaining diplomatic tone that seemed appropriate for speaking with my new mother-in-law about sleeping arrangements with her son. It's been an overwhelming day, and I think we'll both benefit from some private space to process everything. She nodded, though her expression suggested disappointment that her son's marriage would not immediately produce the grandchildren she'd presumably been hoping for. Of course, tomorrow is soon enough to begin discussing family plans and your role in household management. As she departed, I turned to find Matteo watching me with expression that might have been sympathy. She means well, he said quietly. But yes, she has specific expectations about what marriage should entail, and our arrangement doesn't meet most of them. Should I prepare for daily interrogations about why we're not producing heirs with appropriate speed? I asked, only half joking. She'll adjust to reality once it becomes clear that we're committed to making this work in our own way. Matteo's confidence sounded genuine, though I wasn't certain whether it was based on actual knowledge of his mother's flexibility or simply wishful thinking. For tonight, go rest. Tomorrow, we can discuss how to navigate family politics together rather than leaving you to handle their expectations alone. The word together carried more weight than it should have. We were married now, legally bound in ways that made us partners regardless of the unconventional terms of our union. Perhaps partnership based on mutual benefit could evolve into something functional, if not romantic. I climbed the stairs to my suite, each step feeling like leaving one life behind while ascending toward an unknown future. The bedroom was exactly as I'd last seen it, but now it felt different, less like temporary accommodation and more like permanent residence in a home I hadn't chosen but would need to learn to inhabit. The wedding dress came off with difficulty. Too many buttons and hooks to manage alone. I eventually gave up and simply climbed into bed wearing the elaborate gown, too exhausted to care about proper preservation of expensive garments. Tomorrow, I would be Mrs. Matteo Valentino officially, legally, publicly. But tonight, I was simply Isabel Brennan, lying awake in a stranger's house, wondering how long it would take before this situation felt normal, rather than like an elaborate kidnapping dressed up with legal paperwork and religious blessing. The casualness of his message, combined with the formal address at the end, made me smile despite everything. He was trying, in his own way, to make this situation bearable. Perhaps that was enough to build on, for now. I typed a reply. Thank you for the gentle kiss. The photographers got what they needed without either of us feeling too violated. Sleep well, husband. His response came quickly. Boundaries matter, even in situations where most boundaries have already been violated. We'll figure this out, Isabel, one day at a time. One day at a time. It wasn't a romantic promise or a declaration of devotion, but it was realistic acknowledgement that we were both navigating uncharted territory and would need patience with each other and ourselves as we learned to make this arrangement functional. I fell asleep in my wedding dress, in a house that wasn't home, married to a man I barely knew. But somewhere between accepting the situation and resenting it, I'd begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, arranged marriages based on honest acknowledgement of practical necessities might succeed where romantic unions often failed. Or perhaps I was simply exhausted enough that optimism felt easier than continued resistance to circumstances I couldn't change. Chapter 4. Marriage to Matteo Valentino settled into unexpected routine faster than I'd imagined possible. We maintained our agreed-upon separate lives within shared space, crossing paths primarily during meals and public appearances that required us to present united fronts. 3 months after the wedding, I stood in my gallery space, watching contractors complete the final installation work. The warehouse renovation had been completed ahead of schedule and under budget. Benefits of having a husband whose family connections could expedite permits and encourage favorable treatment from city officials who might otherwise have created bureaucratic obstacles. "It's beautiful," Maria said from behind me, her voice carrying genuine pleasure at seeing the project reach completion. "You've created something truly special here." The gallery was everything I'd envisioned during years of careful planning. Exposed brick walls painted white to enhance artwork displays. Track lighting positioned to highlight pieces without overwhelming them. Open floor plan that allowed for flexible arrangements depending on each exhibition's specific needs. This space represented my professional identity. Proof that I could build something meaningful even while navigating circumstances I hadn't chosen. "The opening is in 2 weeks," I said, consulting my calendar. 17 artists confirmed, pieces ranging from contemporary abstracts to classical landscapes. Local press will be covering it. Some regional art magazines have expressed interest. This could actually be successful. "Of course it will be successful," Maria replied with certainty I didn't quite share. "You've put 3 years of planning into this project, brought together talented artists who deserve wider recognition, created a space that fills a genuine gap in the city's cultural infrastructure. Success is practically inevitable." Her confidence was touching, even if somewhat naive about how many carefully planned ventures failed despite best efforts and considerable resources. But her support had been invaluable during these months of transition, providing friendship and practical assistance that made adjustment to Valentino family life more bearable than I'd feared. "Will Mr. Valentino be attending?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral in ways that suggested she had opinions about spousal support that she was carefully not expressing. "He said he'd try," I replied, which was Matteo's standard response to most social obligations that didn't directly serve business purposes. "But there's a property acquisition closing that same evening, so attendance depends on timing and whether negotiations run longer than expected." The truth was more complicated than schedule conflicts. Matteo and I had developed a cordial but emotionally distant relationship, partners in maintaining public appearances while carefully avoiding deeper engagement with each other's inner lives. We were polite, occasionally amusing each other with dry observations about family politics or business complications, but we'd made no progress toward anything resembling genuine intimacy. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, Mateo's private line. I answered while gesturing for Maria to give me a moment of privacy. "Mrs. Valentino," he said, using the formal address that had become something of an inside joke between us. "I'm calling to discuss tomorrow evening's charity gala. My mother wants to ensure you're aware that several important business associates will be in attendance, along with my cousin from Boston, who apparently has strong opinions about American women and their unsuitability as wives for Italian men." "Sounds delightful," I replied dryly. "Should I prepare witty responses to casual misogyny, or simply smile prettily and let you handle the difficult conversations?" "I was hoping you'd educate him about feminist theory while I watch from a safe distance," Mateo said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "He's brilliant at construction management, but remarkably backward about women's rights. Watching him encounter someone who actually challenges his assumptions would be entertaining." This was the Mateo I'd grown comfortable with. Intelligent, sardonic, capable of viewing family politics with the detachment of an anthropologist studying primitive cultural practices. We'd developed a kind of friendship built on shared observations about the absurdity of situations we were both trapped in, finding humor in circumstances that might otherwise be suffocating. "I'll do my best to represent American women and feminist philosophy," I promised, though I make no guarantees about maintaining diplomatic composure if he's particularly offensive. I'll intervene if he crosses lines that require actual confrontation rather than just educational conversation. His reassurance felt genuine, reflecting what had become an unspoken agreement that we would protect each other from the worst excesses of family expectations and social obligations. After ending the call, I returned to find Maria arranging catalog materials for the gallery opening. She looked up with expression that suggested she'd drawn conclusions about my relationship with Mateo from overhearing my half of the conversation. "You've become friends," she observed. "Not quite a question. Not what either of you expected, but perhaps better than the alternative of maintaining hostile distance for decades of forced proximity." "We've become something," I agreed, though friends felt both accurate and inadequate for describing the relationship we'd developed. I'm not certain what that something is, but it's functional and occasionally pleasant, which is more than I'd hoped for when this arrangement began. Maria smiled with something that looked like approval. The best marriages are often built on friendship rather than passion. Passion fades, we all know this, even if we don't like admitting it. But friendship, genuine respect, appreciation for how someone's mind works, these things can sustain partnership for decades after initial attraction has disappeared. Her words echoed thoughts I'd been having lately, but hadn't articulated even to myself. Mateo and I would never have the sweeping romance that novels described or movies depicted. But we might build something more durable, partnership based on mutual benefit, seasoned with genuine affection for each other's personalities, even if we maintained emotional distance that prevented deeper intimacy. The charity gala the following evening was held at one of Chicago's historic hotels, a glittering affair attended by business leaders, politicians, and wealthy families who viewed charitable giving as both moral obligation and networking opportunity. I wore a black evening gown that Maria had helped me select, elegant enough to meet Valentino family standards without being so elaborate that I felt like I was wearing a costume. Mateo met me at the estate's entrance, looking devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo. Marriage hadn't made me immune to noticing his physical attractiveness, even if we'd chosen not to act on whatever chemistry existed between us. "You look stunning," he said, offering his arm with courtly gesture that would have seemed ridiculous from anyone else, but somehow felt natural from him. Ready to face the masses and pretend we're madly in love rather than politely tolerating each other's existence? You know, someday these performances might actually become reality if we keep practicing them convincingly enough, I replied, taking his arm. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps? Or hope? Or simply acknowledgement that the line between performance and reality was blurrier than either of us liked to admit. Would that be so terrible? He asked quietly. If arrangement evolved into something genuine? The question hung between us as we climbed into the waiting car, too significant to address in the moments before arriving at an event that would require hours of public performance. But I found myself considering it seriously for the first time since our wedding day. The gala was exactly as advertised. Hundreds of guests dressed in expensive formal wear, consuming champagne while making small talk about charitable causes and business opportunities. Matteo's cousin Lorenzo proved to be as problematic as predicted, greeting me with barely concealed contempt for American women who didn't understand proper wifely submission. You must find Italian family traditions very different from what you're accustomed to, he said, managing to make simple observations sound like accusation. In Boston, we've maintained the old ways better than some families who've let modern influences corrupt proper values. Fascinating, I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I'm always interested in how people define proper values, and whether those definitions include treating women as independent human beings rather than decorative accessories to male success. Lorenzo's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, irritation, grudging respect for someone willing to directly challenge his assumptions. Matteo warned me you were outspoken.
Did he warn you that I'm also educated, professionally accomplished, and entirely comfortable discussing feminist theory with men who believe women's primary value lies in childbearing and domestic service? I asked sweetly. Because if not, this is going to be a very interesting evening for both of us.
From the corner of my eye, I caught Matteo watching our exchange with barely suppressed amusement. He'd positioned himself close enough to intervene if necessary, but apparently decided I could handle Lorenzo's casual misogyny without assistance. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Lorenzo gradually realizing that I wasn't going to be intimidated or charmed into agreeing with his outdated views about gender roles and family hierarchies. By the time he excused himself to find less challenging company, he looked unsettled in ways that suggested he might actually reconsider some of his assumptions. That was masterful, Matteo said once we were alone. You educated him without being overtly hostile, challenged his beliefs without attacking him personally, and maintained perfect courtesy throughout. It's possible he learned something, which would be a genuine miracle given his usual resistance to ideas that threaten his worldview. Did you enjoy watching me defend feminist philosophy against your cousin's medieval attitudes? I asked, accepting a champagne flute from a passing waiter. I enjoyed watching you be yourself without filtering your intelligence to avoid making men uncomfortable, Matteo replied. You're brilliant, Isabel, and I appreciate that you don't hide that brilliance, even when social circumstances might make it easier to play a less threatening role. The compliment caught me off guard. Sincere appreciation for qualities that many men found intimidating rather than attractive. I studied Matteo's face, seeing something in his expression that went beyond the casual friendship we'd been maintaining. We should probably circulate, I said, suddenly uncomfortable with the intimacy of the moment. Your mother keeps glancing over here, and I suspect she's calculating how long before we produce grandchildren to carry on family traditions. Matteo's laugh held genuine amusement. She's going to be disappointed for quite some time, given that producing children would require considerably more intimacy than we've been comfortable with. Though I suppose we could discuss whether that situation should continue indefinitely or whether some evolution might be appropriate. The suggestion was delivered casually, but I caught the undercurrent of genuine question. Were we going to maintain our separate but married existence indefinitely, or was there possibility for the relationship to develop into something that included physical and emotional intimacy neither of us had been ready for during the early months? That's a conversation for private moments rather than charity galas, I replied, not ready to address such significant questions while surrounded by hundreds of people who viewed our marriage as public spectacle rather than private partnership. Agreed. But perhaps we should schedule such a conversation in the near future, Matteo suggested. 6 months of cordial distance has been comfortable, but I'm beginning to wonder if comfortable is the same as optimal. Before I could respond, his mother appeared with several women she wanted to introduce me to, wives of business associates, potential donors to charitable causes, the usual networking connections that came with marrying into the Valentino family. I allowed myself to be swept into conversations about fundraising and community investment, grateful for the distraction from questions about whether my marriage to Matteo should evolve beyond the carefully maintained boundaries we'd established. But throughout the evening, I found myself returning to his question about whether comfortable was the same as optimal. We'd created a functional partnership, but was functionality enough when we'd legally committed to spending our lives together? Should we at least explore whether the friendship we'd developed could be foundation for something deeper? The drive home passed in thoughtful silence, both of us apparently processing the evening's interactions and unspoken implications. When we arrived at the estate, Matteo walked me to my suite's door, a courtesy he'd maintained since our wedding night, despite its obvious formality. "Thank you for tonight," he said, lingering in the hallway rather than immediately departing for his own rooms. "For handling Lorenzo with grace, for representing the family well, for being exactly who you are, rather than conforming to expectations about proper wifely behavior. Thank you for marrying someone who doesn't conform to those expectations," I replied. "Most men in your position would have chosen someone more traditional, more willing to simply play supportive wife without maintaining independent identity. Most men in my position lack imagination about what marriages could be if we stopped trying to force them into molds that don't fit modern reality," Matteo said. "I married you specifically because you weren't traditional, weren't willing to disappear into a supportive role, weren't going to make this easy by simply conforming to expectations." The admission was more revealing than anything he'd said during our 6 months of marriage. He'd chosen to honor his family's debt specifically by selecting me, someone who would challenge the arrangement rather than meekly accepting it, who would force him to engage rather than allowing him to simply acquire a wife and continue his life unchanged. "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious about motivations that suggested more complex thinking than I'd credited him with. Why deliberately choose difficulty over ease? "Because easy would have been boring, and I'm going to be married to you for the rest of my life," Matteo replied with characteristic directness. "I'd rather spend decades engaged with someone interesting who challenges me than spend decades comfortably bored with someone who simply agrees with everything I say." The honesty was both flattering and somewhat intimidating. He'd viewed our arranged marriage as opportunity rather than obligation, choosing specifically to bind himself to someone who would prevent complacency rather than enable it. "That's either very wise or completely insane," I observed. "I haven't decided which." "Perhaps both," Matteo agreed with a smile. But either way, it's been considerably more interesting than simply acquiring a traditional wife would have been. So, thank you for that, even if you had no choice in being interesting. He kissed my hand with old-fashioned courtesy that should have seemed ridiculous, but somehow felt natural, then departed for his own suite before I could formulate response to his surprising revelations. I lay awake for hours that night, reconsidering everything I thought I understood about our marriage and Mateo's motivations for accepting the arrangement. He hadn't been forced into this union. His family's honor required payment of my father's debt, but he could have negotiated different terms, chosen a different bride, structured the arrangement in countless alternative ways. That he'd specifically chosen this path, chosen me, chosen to create a partnership that challenged rather than comforted, it suggested depths to his character I was only beginning to understand. Perhaps arranged marriages based on strategic thinking rather than romantic passion had possibilities I'd been too angry and resentful to recognize. Perhaps partnership built on mutual respect and genuine intellectual engagement could evolve into something more significant than performance art designed to convince others of affection we didn't feel. Or perhaps I was simply tired and reading too much into casual comments from a man who was good at saying things that sounded meaningful without actually committing to anything beyond the status quo we'd established. Only time would tell which interpretation was closer to truth. Chapter 5. The gallery opening exceeded my wildest expectations. Nearly 200 people attended. Local press provided enthusiastic coverage, and 3 pieces sold on opening night for prices that validated years of careful planning and artist selection. I stood near the main entrance as the evening wound down, exhausted but satisfied in ways that professional success always provided. This was mine, built on my expertise and vision, representing my identity separate from the Valentino family and everything that came with marrying into their world. "Congratulations," Mateo said, appearing beside me with champagne flutes for both of us. "This is remarkable, Isabel. You've created something genuinely significant." He'd arrived late, the property acquisition closing having run longer than anticipated, but he'd come at all, which was more than I'd expected, given how thoroughly we'd maintained separate professional lives during our first 6 months of marriage. "Thank you for coming," I said, accepting the champagne. "I know tonight was complicated with the business closing." "Some things are more important than property acquisitions," he replied, studying the gallery space with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "You've built this entirely through your own efforts and expertise. That deserves recognition and celebration, regardless of other obligations." The sincerity in his voice made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't articulate. We'd maintained emotional distance successfully for months, and his obvious pride in my accomplishment threatened that careful equilibrium. "Would you like the tour?" I asked, deciding that redirecting toward professional discussion was safer than examining why his support mattered more than I wanted to admit. I would. For the next 30 minutes, I walked Mateo through the exhibition, explaining each artist's vision and technical approach, sharing insights about contemporary art market trends and how I'd selected pieces that represented both artistic merit and commercial viability. He listened with focused attention that suggested genuine interest rather than polite tolerance, asking intelligent questions that revealed he'd actually researched enough to engage meaningfully with the subject matter. "This one," he said, stopping before an abstract that dominated the gallery's north wall. "Tell me about this artist." James Sullivan, former military, served 2 tours in Afghanistan before transitioning to art therapy to process PTSD. His work explores trauma and healing through color and form that's simultaneously violent and peaceful. He's one of the most talented artists I've encountered, but galleries have been reluctant to take chances on someone without traditional art school credentials. Matteo studied the piece for a long moment, his expression shifting through several emotions I couldn't interpret. "I want to buy this," he said finally, "and I want to commission a piece for the estate's main salon, something that represents healing rather than simply displaying wealth through expensive acquisitions." The offer surprised me, both for its generosity and for what it revealed about Matteo's character. He wasn't just supporting my gallery. He was recognizing genuine artistic merit and choosing to use his wealth to support an artist who deserved wider recognition. Thank you, I managed, overwhelmed in ways I hadn't expected. James will be thrilled. This commission could launch his career in ways he's been working toward for years. "Then it's worth doing," Matteo replied simply, as if supporting unknown artists was his standard practice rather than an exceptional gesture. Success should be about more than accumulating expensive objects. If my wealth can actually help someone build something meaningful, then spending it serves a purpose beyond simple consumption. As the last guests departed, leaving just gallery staff to manage closing procedures, Matteo and I found ourselves alone in the space I'd spent 3 years envisioning. The artwork glowed under carefully positioned lighting, the architecture felt alive with creative energy, and I experienced a moment of complete satisfaction with professional achievements that existed entirely separate from the complicated circumstances of my marriage. "I'm proud of you," Matteo said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Not as your husband performing obligatory support, but as someone who recognizes how difficult it is to build something genuinely excellent in any field. You've done that here, created something that will matter to this city's cultural landscape for years to come." The genuine pride in his voice was almost painful to hear, making it harder to maintain the emotional distance I'd used to protect myself from getting too attached to someone I'd married under coercion rather than choice. "Why are you being so supportive?" I asked, the question emerging more vulnerably than intended. 6 months of polite distance, and suddenly you're attending openings and commissioning artwork and saying things that make it difficult to remember that this marriage is an arrangement rather than a choice. Matteo was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh how much honesty was appropriate. "Because I've been thinking about what our marriage could be if we stopped treating it like an unfortunate circumstance we're simply enduring until death releases us from obligations neither of us wanted. What could it be?" The question felt dangerous, like stepping toward a precipice without knowing what lay beyond the edge. "Partnership," he said simply. "Not just the performance we've been maintaining for family and business associates, but genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and appreciation for who we actually are rather than who we're supposed to be." "We barely know each other," I protested, though the observation felt less true than it would have months earlier. 6 months of carefully maintained distance doesn't create the foundation for real partnership. "Then perhaps it's time to change that," Matteo suggested. "Stop maintaining distance. Start actually learning about each other. Discover whether the friendship we've been developing could evolve into something more significant." The proposal was both terrifying and strangely appealing. I'd been so focused on protecting myself from getting hurt in a marriage I hadn't chosen that I'd never considered whether choosing to engage rather than simply endure might create possibilities worth exploring. "I need time to think about this," I said finally, honest about my uncertainty even as part of me wanted to accept his invitation immediately. "Of course. I'm not asking for immediate decisions or dramatic changes to arrangements we've established. Just consider the possibility that this marriage could be more than a sentence we're serving together. That's all I'm asking." As we drove back to the estate, I found myself reconsidering everything about our relationship. Matteo had proven himself thoughtful, respectful of boundaries, genuinely interested in my success and happiness, rather than simply viewing me as acquired asset that reflected well on his business image. He made me laugh with sardonic observations about family politics, challenged my thinking without being condescending, and had demonstrated consistent integrity in honoring the terms of our arrangement. Perhaps choosing to build on that foundation made sense, even if the beginning of our relationship hadn't been what either of us would have preferred. That night, for the first time since our wedding, I lay awake wondering what it might be like to actually choose this marriage rather than simply accepting it as inevitable fate. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Opening myself to someone I'd been keeping at arm's length for months, taking the risk of genuine emotional investment in a relationship that had begun as coercion. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from Matteo. "Thank you for letting me share your success tonight. Whatever you decide about us, know that I'm genuinely proud of what you've accomplished." I stared at the message for a long moment before typing a response. Thank you for supporting an artist who deserves recognition, and thank you for being patient while I figure out what I want this marriage to be. His reply came quickly. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. We have literally the rest of our lives to figure this out." The rest of our lives? Such a long time to spend with someone, either as cordial strangers sharing space or as genuine partners building something meaningful together. The choice between those futures suddenly felt more significant than any decision I'd made since agreeing to marry him in the first place. Chapter 6. 3 weeks after the gallery opening, Matteo invited me to dinner at a restaurant neither of us had been to before, neutral territory away from the estate and the public places where we typically performed our married couple roles for the benefit of watching audiences. "I thought we should have a conversation away from family and business associates," he explained when suggesting the evening. "Somewhere we can be honest without worrying about who might overhear or misinterpret what we're discussing." The restaurant was elegant but unpretentious, the kind of place where successful professionals ate without drawing particular attention. We were seated at a corner table that offered both privacy and excellent views of the Chicago skyline, conversation competing with the comfortable hum of other diners engaged in their own discussions. "I've been thinking about your proposal," I said, once we'd ordered, deciding that directness was preferable to dancing around the subject that had prompted this dinner, about whether we should try to build something genuine rather than simply maintaining the arrangement we've established. "And?" Matteo's voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away about what answer he hoped to hear. "I'm terrified," I admitted, surprising myself with the vulnerability. "I've spent 6 months protecting myself emotionally, maintaining distance that felt necessary for surviving a marriage I didn't choose. The idea of deliberately dismantling those protections and opening myself to someone who could hurt me, it's terrifying in ways I didn't expect." Matteo nodded, his expression suggesting he understood the fear I was describing. "I'm equally terrified," he said quietly. "I've spent decades building walls around anything resembling genuine emotion, viewing relationships as strategic alliances rather than opportunities for actual connection. Suggesting we try for something authentic means admitting that those walls have become prison rather than protection." The mutual acknowledgement of fear created unexpected intimacy, both of us confessing to vulnerabilities that contradicted the confident facades we typically maintained. "What would trying actually look like?" I asked. "Not theoretically, but practically. What changes between us if we decide to pursue genuine partnership rather than simply maintaining polite distance?" Matteo considered the question carefully, seeming to organize his thoughts before responding. "We stop avoiding each other," he began. "Currently, we time our schedules to minimize contact, except when required for public appearances. We change that, share meals more regularly, spend evenings together without feeling like we're performing obligations, actually talk about things that matter rather than restricting conversation to safe subjects that don't risk emotional exposure." "That sounds exhausting," I observed, only half joking. "All that communication and emotional availability." "Probably," Matteo agreed with a slight smile, "but possibly less exhausting than spending decades maintaining careful distance from someone we live with. That has its own costs, even if they're different from the costs of actual intimacy." Our food arrived, providing a natural pause in conversation that was becoming increasingly significant. I studied Matteo across the table, trying to see him objectively rather than through the lens of resentment I'd been carrying since our wedding day. He was handsome. That had never been in question. But more than physical attractiveness, he possessed intelligence and wit that made conversation engaging, integrity that meant he honored commitments even when they were inconvenient, and thoughtfulness that manifested in small gestures I'd tried not to notice because noticing them would make maintaining emotional distance more difficult. "I want to try," I said finally, the decision feeling both momentous and fragile. "Not because I'm certain it will work or because I've forgiven the circumstances that forced us together, but because spending the rest of my life wondering what we might have built seems worse than risking hurt by actually trying to build something." The relief that flooded Matteo's expression was answer enough about how much my agreement meant to him, even though he'd been careful not to pressure me toward any particular decision. "We take this slowly," he said, establishing parameters that made the prospect feel more manageable. "No dramatic changes overnight, no pressure to immediately become something we're not ready to be. We simply try, spend time together, talk honestly, see if the foundation we've built over 6 months can support something more substantial." "Slowly works," I agreed, grateful for his understanding that I couldn't simply flip a switch and transform resentment into affection through force of will. The rest of dinner passed in conversation that felt different from our previous interactions, less carefully guarded, more genuinely interested in each other's thoughts and experiences. Matteo told me about growing up in a family where power was currency and trust was liability, about learning to separate genuine connection from strategic alliance, at an age when most children were still believing in fairy tales. I shared stories about my mother's illness, about watching medical bills consume everything my family had, while insurance companies found creative ways to avoid paying for treatments that might have extended her life. About the desperation that had led my father to make promises he'd hoped would never be called due, and the guilt I carried for resenting him even though I understood he'd been trying to save someone he loved. "I hated him for a while," I admitted, the confession emerging more easily than it would have before tonight. Hated that his desperation became my imprisonment, that promises he'd made bound me to a life I never chose. But watching him age 10 years in the 6 months since our wedding, I can't maintain that anger when I see what it costs him to know he traded his daughter's freedom for his wife's final years. "You're remarkably forgiving," Matteo observed. "Many people would have nursed that resentment indefinitely, used it as excuse to make everyone around them miserable in payment for their own misery." "I considered it," I replied honestly. "Seriously considered making this marriage as unpleasant as possible for you, punishing you for circumstances that weren't actually your fault either. But spite is exhausting, and ultimately we'd both suffer if I committed to making our shared life miserable." "So you chose grace instead," Matteo said softly. Decided that accepting reality and trying to make it bearable was preferable to fighting battles you couldn't win. I chose survival, I corrected. Grace makes it sound noble, when really it was just pragmatism. You've been decent to me, more than decent actually. Maintaining anger towards someone who's treating you well requires energy I'd rather spend on other things. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Matteo hesitated before asking a question that felt weighted with significance. Would you like to have a nightcap at the estate? In the library, maybe, where we can continue this conversation without time pressure or restaurant closing hours forcing us apart. The invitation was clearly more than just suggesting another drink. It was opening a door to continued intimacy, to extending the evening beyond what public dinner required, to choosing to spend time together rather than immediately retreating to our separate lives. I'd like that, I said, the words feeling like crossing a threshold I couldn't uncross. The estate's library had become my favorite room during the past 6 months. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes that showed signs of actual reading. Comfortable seating arranged to encourage long hours spent absorbed in literature or thought. Matteo had given me keys shortly after our wedding, saying the space was meant to be used rather than simply preserved as decorative backdrop. He poured brandy while I settled into one of the leather chairs positioned near the fireplace, which he lit with practiced efficiency that suggested this was routine rather than special occasion. Tell me something you've never told anyone, Matteo said, once we were both seated, the request delivered with genuine curiosity rather than as challenge or game. I considered the question, sorting through potential revelations for something that felt true, but not so vulnerable that sharing it would make me regret the impulse toward honesty. I'm terrified of becoming my mother, I said finally. Not in the obvious way of fearing cancer or premature death, but of the smaller ways she disappeared into being someone's wife and mother, sacrificing her own ambitions and identity until there was nothing left except roles she played for other people. I loved her desperately, but I also saw how she'd given up art school dreams and professional aspirations to support my father's career, and I'm terrified of waking up one day and realizing I've done the same thing. Matteo was quiet for a long moment, absorbing what I'd shared. Is that why you insisted on continuing your gallery project? He asked. Not just professional ambition, but existential fear of losing yourself? Partially, I admitted. The gallery represents proof that I still exist as separate person with my own vision and goals. It's insurance against disappearing completely into being Mrs. Matteo Valentino instead of Isabel Brennan, who happens to be married. I would never ask you to sacrifice your identity, Matteo said with intensity that made the promise feel like a vow. One of the things I find most compelling about you is your absolute refusal to conform to expectations about proper wifely behavior. Watching you maintain that independence while navigating family politics that could easily overwhelm someone less stubborn has been inspiring, honestly. The vulnerability in his admission matched my own, both of us offering truths that revealed more than surface conversation typically allowed. Your turn, I said, wanting reciprocal honesty rather than feeling like only I was exposing myself. Tell me something you've never told anyone. Matteo swirled his brandy, seeming to consider how much truth he was willing to share. I'm terrified of becoming my father, he said, echoing my confession with his own variation. Not in the obvious way of fearing I'll become violent or abusive. He never was, actually, just cold and calculating about everything, including family relationships. But I see his emotional isolation, his inability to trust anyone enough to be genuinely vulnerable, and I recognize those same patterns in myself. Building walls so high that no one can hurt you also means no one can reach you, and I'm terrified I've already gone too far down that path to find my way back. The raw honesty made him seem more human than he'd appeared during any of our previous interactions, more than the controlled businessman or the sardonic observer of family politics. This was Matteo without protective distance, admitting to fears that mirrored my own in essential ways. "Maybe we can help each other," I suggested quietly. "I'll remind you that vulnerability isn't weakness, and you'll remind me that maintaining independent identity doesn't require emotional isolation." "A support system disguised as a marriage," Matteo observed with slight smile. "Not the romantic vision most people have of matrimony, but possibly more valuable." We talked for hours that night, the conversation ranging across topics we'd been avoiding during 6 months of careful distance. Family histories and professional ambitions, fears and hopes, the accumulated experiences that had shaped us into people capable of navigating arranged marriage with more grace than anger. It was 3 a.m. when I finally stood to leave, exhausted but satisfied in ways that had nothing to do with physical intimacy and everything to do with genuine connection I hadn't expected to find with the man I'd been forced to marry. "Thank you for tonight," I said as Matteo walked me to my suite's door, continuing the courtesy he'd maintained since our wedding, despite its increasing irrelevance. "Thank you for taking the risk," he replied, "for choosing to try rather than simply accepting that polite distance was the best we could manage." He kissed my forehead, a gesture of affection that felt intimate without being sexual, promising without demanding anything I wasn't ready to give. As I prepared for bed, I realized that something fundamental had shifted between us. We were no longer simply two people trapped in arrangement neither had chosen, performing required roles while maintaining emotional safety through distance. We were becoming partners, building something genuine on the foundation of forced proximity and mutual respect that had somehow survived months of resentment and careful guardedness. Whether that partnership would eventually include physical intimacy remained uncertain. But for now, emotional intimacy felt significant enough, proof that arranged marriages could evolve into something more meaningful than the transactions that had created them. Chapter 7. The transition from careful distance to genuine partnership wasn't the smooth evolution I'd hoped for. 2 months after our dinner conversation, Matteo and I were navigating daily life together with mixed success. Some days felt natural and comfortable, while others reminded us why we'd maintained protective distance for so long. "You're angry with me," I observed one evening, when Matteo had been avoiding conversation for 3 days following a disagreement about his family's business practices. "I'm not angry," he replied, with tone that clearly indicated he was, in fact, angry. "I'm simply processing." "Processing what?" I pressed, refusing to let him retreat into the cold distance that had characterized his father's relationships. "That I asked uncomfortable questions about whether the construction company is still laundering money through legitimate contracts? That's not unreasonable curiosity. That's me trying to understand the risks associated with being married to you." The argument that followed was fierce and painful, the first real fight we'd had since beginning to build genuine partnership. Matteo accused me of being naive about business realities in industries controlled by families like his. I accused him of being defensive about practices he knew were morally questionable, hiding behind family loyalty rather than admitting he was making choices that compromised the legitimate businessman image he claimed to be building. "You knew who I was when you agreed to this marriage," Matteo said, his voice cold in ways I hadn't heard since our first meeting. "You knew my family's history, the businesses we control, the methods we've used to accumulate and maintain power. Acting shocked now is disingenuous." "I agreed to marry you because I had no choice," I shot back, hurt manifesting as anger. "And yes, I knew your family's reputation, but I thought you were different. You told me you were transitioning toward legitimate operations, moving away from the traditions that built Valentino wealth. Was that a lie?" "It was the truth as I understood it then," Matteo replied. "But transitioning from generations of certain practices takes time and careful strategy. I can't simply announce that we're going completely legitimate overnight without creating problems with family members who view such changes as betrayal of everything we've built." "So you're trapped too," I said, understanding dawning with that clarity that comes from stepping back and seeing patterns rather than focusing on individual conflicts. "You're as stuck as I am. Bound by family expectations and obligations you can't escape without destroying relationships that matter to you." The anger drained from Matteo's expression, replaced by resignation that spoke to years of navigating impossible situations with no good options. "Yes," he admitted quietly, "I'm trapped between the man I'm trying to become and the legacy I inherited. Every decision involves choosing between progress and preservation, between what's right and what's expected." The fight didn't resolve our fundamental disagreement about business ethics and acceptable compromises with family tradition, but it did create understanding about the pressures we were both navigating, the competing loyalties and impossible choices that characterized life in families like the Valentinos. "I can't condone illegal activities," I said after long silence, "but I can try to understand why you're making difficult choices in impossible situations. That doesn't mean I won't continue asking uncomfortable questions or challenging decisions I think are wrong." "I wouldn't want you to stop," Matteo replied. "Having someone who holds me accountable rather than simply enabling increasingly questionable choices is actually valuable, even when it's uncomfortable." We fell into uneasy truce after that fight, not complete reconciliation, but acknowledgement that building genuine partnership meant navigating conflicts rather than avoiding them through careful distance. We continued sharing meals, spending evenings together, talking about topics that mattered even when those conversations were difficult. The gallery's success created its own complications. As my professional reputation grew, I found myself pulled into social circles that occasionally intersected uncomfortably with Matteo's business interests. Art collectors who wanted favors from the Valentino family. Business associates trying to use social connections to gain advantages in negotiations. People who viewed my marriage as opportunity for access rather than respecting it as private relationship separate from professional dealings. "Someone approached me at the gallery today," I told Matteo one evening over dinner. "A developer who wants to acquire property in the warehouse district. He seemed to think that being married to you meant I could influence decisions about zoning variances and permit approvals." Matteo's expression darkened in ways that made him seem more dangerous than I typically allowed myself to acknowledge. "Did he explicitly ask you to intercede with me on his behalf?" He implied it strongly enough that I understood what he wanted. I told him my professional work was separate from family business and that he should pursue normal channels rather than trying to use social connections for unfair advantages. "Good. I'll make certain he understands that using my wife as back-channel communication device is unacceptable." Matteo's voice carried controlled anger that suggested the developer would be regretting his approach. "You shouldn't have to navigate these situations alone." "I can handle myself," I protested, uncomfortable with the implication that I needed protection from uncomfortable social interactions. "I know you can," Matteo replied, "but you shouldn't have to. Part of what I can offer in this partnership is shielding you from people who view you as a tool for accessing Valentino family resources, rather than respecting you as independent professional with your own expertise and boundaries." The protection felt both comforting and suffocating. I valued my independence, but I also appreciated not having to constantly fend off people trying to use our marriage for their own purposes. As fall transitioned toward winter, Matteo and I developed routines that felt increasingly natural. We shared breakfast most mornings, discussing plans for the day ahead. We spent evenings in the library, reading or working separately, but in comfortable proximity. We attended family gatherings and business functions together, our public partnership now reflecting genuine connection rather than simply performed unity. But we maintained separate bedrooms, the physical intimacy that typically characterized marriage remaining absent from our arrangement. The topic hung between us unspoken, both of us aware that our partnership was incomplete in this crucial way, but neither quite ready to address what it would mean to take that final step toward fully realized marriage. "Do you ever think about it?" I asked one evening, when we'd both had enough wine that honest questions felt less dangerous. "About whether we should complete our marriage in the traditional sense?" Matteo was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Constantly," he admitted. "But I'm afraid of pushing for something you're not ready for, of damaging what we've built by trying to move faster than you're comfortable with." "What if I'm ready?" The question emerged before I could second-guess the wisdom of asking it. What if the distance we're maintaining is now about fear rather than necessary protection? "Then we take that risk together," Matteo said, his voice carrying a mixture of desire and caution that matched my own conflicted feelings. But slowly, carefully, with full understanding that physical intimacy will change our relationship in ways we can't completely predict or control. The conversation felt momentous, acknowledging possibility without demanding immediate action. We were opening door to deeper connection while respecting that crossing that threshold required courage and trust we were still building. That night, as I lay awake in my separate bedroom, I found myself genuinely considering what it would mean to invite Matteo into not just my home and daily life, but into the most intimate spaces I'd been protecting since our wedding day. The thought was terrifying and exciting in equal measure. Risk and promise balanced on knife's edge of decision I wasn't quite ready to make, but knew I would eventually need to face. Our partnership was growing stronger each week, the foundation we'd built proving capable of supporting honest disagreements and difficult conversations. But physical intimacy represented final barrier, the last protection against complete vulnerability with someone I'd been forced to marry but was choosing to love despite those coerced beginnings. The question wasn't whether I would eventually take that risk, but when I would be brave enough to admit that I wanted to. Chapter 8. The Valentino family Christmas party was legendary, an elaborate affair that required weeks of preparation and attracted several hundred guests ranging from family members to business associates to politicians whose favor the family had cultivated through years of strategic relationship building. "You'll do fine," Matteo assured me as we prepared to descend the main staircase and officially begin the evening's festivities. "Just smile, make small talk, and avoid discussing politics or religion with my Uncle Roberto. He has strong opinions about both and insufficient social skills to express them diplomatically." I wore a dress that Maria had helped me select. emerald green velvet that was elegant without being ostentatious, appropriate for both family celebration and business networking. Matteo wore a tailored suit that made him look devastatingly handsome, his dark hair styled with just enough carelessness to suggest he hadn't spent hours achieving the effect. "We look good together," I observed, studying our reflection in the hallway mirror. "Very convincing married couple." "We are a married couple," Matteo corrected gently. "The convincing part is no longer performance." The observation was accurate. Somewhere during the past 9 months, our arrangement had transformed into something genuine. Partnership built on mutual respect, seasoned with affection that had grown from shared experiences and honest conversation. The party was everything I'd been warned it would be. Crowds of people consuming expensive champagne while networking with strategic precision. Family members performing their assigned roles in maintaining Valentino power and prestige. An atmosphere that mixed celebration with subtle displays of wealth and influence. Matteo's mother cornered me within the first hour, her smile carrying speculation I'd learned to interpret during months of family gatherings. "Isabel, dear," she said, her tone suggesting this was personal conversation disguised as casual inquiry. "I've been noticing how close you and Matteo have become. The family is quite pleased with how well you've adapted to your role." "Thank you," I replied, maintaining diplomatic tone that gave nothing away about the complexity of my relationship with her son. "We were hoping," she continued, lowering her voice in ways that signaled she was approaching her actual agenda, "that you might announce happy news tonight. The family has been so patient, but after 9 months of marriage, certain expectations become difficult to ignore." The pressure to produce grandchildren had been increasing steadily, family members dropping increasingly obvious hints that my primary obligation was securing the next generation of Valentino heirs. I'd been deflecting such comments with practiced grace, but Matteo's mother apparently decided direct conversation was necessary. "Mrs. Valentino," I said carefully, "I appreciate the family's interest in our personal life, but those decisions are between Matteo and me. When we have news to share, you'll be among the first to know." Her expression tightened slightly, displeasure at my refusal to commit to her timeline evident despite her efforts to maintain pleasant facade. "Of course, I simply wanted you to understand that family continuity is important, and that your role includes more than simply being ornamental addition to family gatherings." The conversation left me feeling defensive and angry, not at her specifically, but at the persistent pressure to conform to expectations about what marriage should entail. I found Matteo across the room, deep in conversation with business associates, but he must have sensed my distress because he immediately excused himself and approached with concern evident in his expression. "What happened?" he asked quietly, guiding me toward a relatively private corner of the ballroom. "Your mother wants grandchildren and feels comfortable expressing her disappointment that we haven't provided them yet," I replied, trying to keep frustration from making my voice sharp. "Apparently, 9 months is insufficient patience for family matriarchs who view reproduction as primary wifely obligation." Matteo's jaw tightened with anger that seemed directed at his mother rather than at me. "I'll speak with her. That's inappropriate pressure, and she knows better than to make you uncomfortable about personal decisions." "Don't," I said, touching his arm to prevent him from immediately confronting her. "It won't help, and it will just create family drama during what's supposed to be celebration. I can handle disappointed maternal expectations." "You shouldn't have to handle them alone," Matteo replied. "Part of what I signed up for when we agreed to build genuine partnership was protecting you from exactly this kind of family interference." The rest of the evening passed without further incident, though I remained hyper-aware of Matteo's family watching us with speculation about when we would fulfill expectations, about producing heirs and continuing bloodlines that dated back generations. As the party wound down and guests began departing, Matteo and I found ourselves alone in the library, our customary retreat after difficult social obligations. He poured brandy while I removed my heels, grateful to be finished with performance and able to simply exist without maintaining careful facades. "I'm sorry about my mother," Matteo said, settling into the chair beside mine. "She has strong opinions about family obligations and insufficient awareness of appropriate boundaries." "She's not wrong that we're avoiding the topic," I observed, deciding that the evening's confrontation had made avoidance less appealing than honest conversation. 9 months of marriage, and we're still maintaining separate bedrooms like roommates who happen to be legally bound to each other. Matteo was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider how to respond to observation that touched on territory we'd been carefully not addressing. "Are you suggesting we should change that arrangement?" he asked carefully. "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to acknowledge that the distance we're maintaining is now about fear rather than necessary protection," I replied, echoing the conversation we'd had weeks earlier without reaching any resolution. "We've built something real, Matteo. The partnership we talked about creating has actually happened. But we're both still too afraid of being hurt to take the final step toward complete intimacy." "I'm terrified," he admitted with vulnerability I'd rarely heard from him. "Terrified that physical intimacy will somehow break what we've built, that crossing that line will reveal that our partnership only works because we've maintained careful boundaries." "I'm terrified too," I confessed, "but I'm more terrified of looking back in 20 years and realizing we let fear prevent us from discovering what we might have become if we'd been brave enough to take the risk." We sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, both of us processing the significance of what we were acknowledging, that we'd reached a point where the relationship could either deepen into complete marriage or remain permanently arrested at the stage of comfortable friendship with legal documentation. "If we do this," Matteo said slowly, "we do it with full understanding that there's no going back to the careful distance we've been maintaining. Physical intimacy will change everything between us, for better or worse." "I understand," I replied, my heart racing with a combination of anticipation and anxiety. "And I'm ready to take that risk. I choose you, Matteo, not because I was forced to marry you, but because I've spent 9 months discovering that you're someone worth choosing deliberately." The words hung in the air between us, significant beyond their simple expression. I was declaring that our marriage had transformed from coerced arrangement into voluntary partnership, that I was making the choice our families had denied me on our wedding day. Matteo stood, offering his hand with gesture that felt both familiar and momentous. "Then let's discover together what our marriage can become when we stop letting fear dictate our boundaries." I took his hand, allowing him to draw me to my feet and into embrace that felt different from the careful physical contact we'd maintained during months of building trust. This was intimate without being sexual, promising without demanding anything I wasn't ready to give. "Not tonight," I said quietly, needing to establish that choosing intimacy didn't mean rushing toward physical consummation before I was emotionally prepared, but soon, when we're both ready to take that final step. "Whenever you're ready," Matteo agreed, his voice carrying promise that felt more significant than demands would have been. "We've waited this long. I can wait until you're certain." As we stood together in the library, holding each other with gentleness that spoke to genuine affection rather than obligation, I realized that arranged marriages could become real love stories if both parties were willing to take the risks necessary for transformation. We'd been forced together by circumstance, but we were choosing to build something genuine on that coerced foundation. The journey from resentful captivity to willing partnership had been longer and more difficult than either of us had anticipated. But standing in Mateo's arms, feeling safe rather than trapped, chosen rather than acquired, I understood finally that some of the best things in life came from making peace with circumstances beyond our control and choosing to build beauty from situations that initially seemed designed only to cause pain. We had the rest of our lives to discover what our partnership would become. But for tonight, simply acknowledging that we were partners by choice rather than force felt like enough. Promise of futures we would build together, deliberately and with full understanding of what we were creating. Epilogue. 5 years later, I stood in the gallery's main room, watching visitors examine the latest exhibition while our daughter played quietly in my office nearby. Claire was 3 years old now, with Mateo's dark hair and my stubbornness, equally comfortable at family gatherings and art openings because she'd been raised to navigate both worlds with ease. The gallery had become one of Chicago's premier contemporary art spaces, known for championing emerging artists and maintaining ethical business practices that set standards for the industry. My professional reputation had grown independently of the Valentino name, though I'd learned to appreciate how family connections could be used for good when applied strategically. "Mrs. Valentino," James Sullivan said, approaching with exhibition catalog in hand, "I wanted to thank you again for the opportunity. 5 years ago, you took a chance on a veteran with PTSD trying to process trauma through art. Now I'm represented in major galleries across the country." "You did the work," I replied, genuinely pleased by his success. "I just provided platform for people to recognize talent that was already there." As James departed to speak with potential collectors, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since the night I'd married Mateo under coercion rather than choice. The arrangement that had begun as imprisonment had evolved into partnership I wouldn't trade for any of the freedom I'd thought I wanted 5 years earlier. Mateo appeared in the gallery entrance, Claire immediately squealing with delight and running to greet her father with enthusiasm that never failed to make me smile. He scooped her up with practiced ease, making her laugh with exaggerated concern about how much she'd grown since this morning. "How's the opening going?" he asked, approaching me with our daughter balanced on one hip. "Successfully," I replied, stealing a kiss that felt natural after years of genuine intimacy. 3 pieces sold in the first hour, and several collectors are interested in commissioning work from artists we're featuring." "Excellent. Ready to head home? Mama's been cooking all afternoon for family dinner, and she'll be insulted if we're late." Family dinners had become regular occurrence once Mateo's parents accepted that our marriage was real, despite its unconventional beginning and our continued refusal to conform to all their expectations about proper family behavior. They adored Claire, which helped them overlook that her parents maintained partnership based on mutual respect rather than traditional gender roles they've been raised to expect. As we drove toward the Valentino estate, our home now rather than the prison I'd once feared it would become, I found myself grateful for the journey that had brought us here. The arranged marriage that had seemed like death sentence had become foundation for life, richer than anything I'd imagined during the years I'd spent protecting my independence. "You're thinking deep thoughts," Mateo observed, catching my expression. "Just reflecting on how wrong I was about what this marriage would become," I admitted. 5 years ago, I was terrified of disappearing into being your wife instead of remaining myself. turned out I could be both, fully myself and fully yours simultaneously. You were never in danger of disappearing, Matteo replied. You're too stubborn to let anyone erase you, even when circumstances seemed designed to do exactly that. Claire had fallen asleep in her car seat, exhausted from the excitement of spending afternoon at the gallery. I turned to watch her sleeping face, marveling at how someone so small could represent such an enormous choice to fully commit to the marriage that had begun as coercion. No regrets? Matteo asked quietly. About marrying you under duress and taking 5 years to fully forgive the circumstances that brought us together? I smiled despite the weight of the question. Some regrets about the beginning, maybe, but no regrets about what we built from that difficult foundation. Fair enough, he agreed. I have regrets about the method, even if I'm grateful for the result. Turns out the best things in life sometimes come from situations we'd never choose voluntarily, but learn to transform into something better than we'd imagined possible. As we pulled through the estate gates, I saw Matteo's family gathered on the front steps. His parents, his sister with her husband and children, various cousins and extended relatives who'd become part of my chosen family over the years. They were loud, occasionally overwhelming, and had opinions about everything from child rearing to business decisions. But they were also generous, loyal, and had welcomed me despite their knowledge that I'd entered the family under coercion rather than joyful acceptance. Ready? Matteo asked, unbuckling Claire gently to avoid waking her. Always, I replied, meaning it. Ready to face family dinners and business complications. Ready to navigate the ongoing challenges of maintaining independent identity while building shared life. Ready to continue discovering what arranged marriage could become when both parties chose to transform coercion into voluntary partnership. We'd been forced together by circumstances neither of us would have chosen. But we'd built something genuine from that difficult beginning. Love that was real precisely because we'd had to work for it. Partnership that was strong because we'd chosen it deliberately after understanding exactly what it required. Some of the best stories began with terrible circumstances and ended with chosen families built from unchosen obligations. Ours was one of those stories. Imperfect, complicated, but ultimately more valuable than easier paths might have been. As we entered the house with our sleeping daughter and our complicated, loving, chosen family waiting inside, I realized that arranged marriages could become the greatest love stories of all. Not in spite of their difficult beginnings, but because of them. Proof that love could be built deliberately, brick by brick, choice by choice, until something beautiful emerged from foundations that had initially seemed designed only for imprisonment. The end.